Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the ISO 9001 2015, Knowing What to Expect to Ensure a Stress-Free Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I'm the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone before we get started. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address the questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do that in two ways. The slides, if you want to download the slides, those will be posted to our website shortly after we're finished here. And if you'd like to rewatch the webinar with the voiceover, it'll be posted in a few hours to our YouTube page, and that's also accessible on our website. Just look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, I've got some opening comments on ISO 9001 2015 itself and some items just to consider. We'll have a little bit of an explanation on how we came up with this presentation, our methodology. And I've broken down the main part of this presentation into 5 key areas. And we're going to be exploring those in some depth. I've got some commentary on 2 additional key areas after that, some comments on the role of leadership in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. At that time, we'll have concluding remarks and your questions. Now, before we dive into expectations within an audit and preparing for an audit, it's important to recognize that ISO 9001 has always been an interpretive document from day one. And that's never been more true than the 2015 revision. And there's a couple of things to point out in terms of really how deep they went with making this an interpretive document. When the 2015 revision was published, it was actually the first version of ISO 9001 to have an explanatory appendix. So if you look at Appendix A, there are 8 explanatory subclauses, really, that have been written right into the standard. Now, since it was published, it has become one of the only ISO published standards to have a separate supplemental standard for further explanatory purposes. So let's learn about that. And that document, as you can see, it was published the following year in 2016, is the ISO TS, that stands for Technical Specification 9002. Now, this was published on November 1st, a little over a year after 9001 was published. Its full title is Quality Management Systems Guidelines for the Application of ISO 9001 2015. Now, this is a sanctioned guidance document, and it provides clause-by-clause ideas on fulfilling the requirements. Now, it's important to note that 9002 is not an auditable document. It's intended to be primarily for users, for organizations that are trying to implement 9001. But it is not a document that an auditor can pull out and cite in the context of an audit. Now, for anybody on our call today that remembers when the ISO 9001-2000 standard was published, you may remember what the ISO 9004 document looked like at that time. At that time, 9004 was also very much a crib notes version, if you will, of the ISO 9001 standard. So that gives you some context. Now, if you're interested in purchasing ISO 9002, it is available right on the ISO website. So if you go to iso.org, you can purchase a copy of ISO 9002 for yourself. Okay, so because ISO 9001 2015 is an interpretive document, it's important to recognize that by the name alone, it means that ISO 9001 is intended to be interpreted. And none of the requirements from ISO 9001 have a perfect method for implementation. This is something that it's left to the individual organization to determine what the methodology is going to be, and then the auditor's role is to review what's been done, and then the auditor has to exercise their judgment as to whether or not what the organization did represents a true fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one of the things I'd like to lead in with, because we do get asked about this still quite a bit, it is important to recognize that with the 2015 revision of ISO 9001, the very last of the required procedures was eliminated. Now, if you go back to the first and second editions of ISO 9001, back then there were 16 required procedures. Now, that was scaled back in the 2000 and 2008 revisions to just 6, and we now have absolutely no required procedures. So it's natural for someone to assume, well, if I don't have to have them, that means they're not subject to audit. Not true. If an organization chooses to have a procedure or a work instruction for any activity, it's important to recognize that the content of that procedure can be cited in the context of an audit. It's a self-imposed set of requirements, and that is due to how the term audit criteria is defined in the ISO 9000 document, among other places. Audit criteria is understood as a set of policies, procedures, or requirements that are used as reference against which the objective evidence is compared. So in other words, if you choose to have a procedure, we are permitted to hold you accountable to what you write into that procedure. So do bear that in mind. Now, ISO 9001 2015 at this point, it seems unbelievable. It's actually been in print now for almost 5 years. And ISO 9001 itself, well, that's been around for 30 plus years. Now, you'd think after all that time, some of these requirements would be a little bit better understood and some of these nonconformances would stop coming up. But that's actually not the case. Year over year, we see the same things being cited in one audit after another. So in the early days when this presentation was first put together, I did some research and culled about 350 audits from a period of time running roughly October 2017 to October 2018, and analyzed where were the nonconformances being written, where were the items that were coming up the most in the context of an audit. And I came up with a top 5, and these have actually been ordered in terms of how often they came up. The number 1 issue was management review meetings, followed by internal audits, followed by quality objectives, followed by calibration or verification of measuring and monitoring resources, and lastly, external provider approvals. And obviously, there's all kinds of other things that are getting cited, but as far as patterns are concerned, this is your top 5. Now, what's interesting to note here is that from this list, 3 of these items, management review, internal audit, and calibration, these are all legacy requirements that have been included in ISO 9001 from day 1, all the way back to 1987. So these are not new requirements by any means. So as we've already established, it is an interpretive document, and obviously PJR as a certification body, we cannot advocate a specific methodology. We can't tell you how to implement your system. That would be a conflict of interest. But what we can do is attempt to provide some clarity on what these requirements are commonly interpreted to mean and how they are commonly fulfilled. So over the next several slides, I'm going to walk you through some of these ideas. Now, The content of these next several slides is not to be taken as an official endorsement of approach, and it cannot be used as justification for a circumstance cited by an auditor within an official nonconformance. Now we're going to, towards the end of the presentation, we're going to discuss how you can have an impartial resolution of a disputed nonconformance, and we'll get into disputes towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's get going. Our first requirement that we're going to go over, as I said, is management review. This was the #1 issue that was cited in audits in the sample period. Management review is primarily found in section 9.3. And section 9.3 is broken down into 3 subclauses. Now for this presentation, we're going to refer to these as parts. So let's begin with part 1. Part 1 states that management shall review the organization's quality management system at planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, and alignment with the strategic direction of the organization. Now the key takeaway from this here is this business of planned intervals. Now that statement intends for the organization to have some manner of controlling the frequency and the content of the management review meetings. Now, what that means is up to you as the organization, however that's controlled. So we have seen things like schedules, procedural stipulations, automated reminders, and so forth. But the key is you have to be able to show us that you are planning the management review activity in some way, shape, or form. Now in part 2 of the requirement from the standard, it says that the management review again needs to be planned and carried out taking into consideration. And then there's a long list of stuff that you're supposed to discuss. Now I'm not going to read this to you. We'll be on this slide for 20 minutes. But I want you to note the depth of which the items are presented here. There's prior management reviews, nonconformances and corrective actions, audit results, external provider performance. There's lots of content here. And you might be inclined to think, wow, that's a lot to go through in one meeting. So let's talk about our key takeaway here. First of all of the content items are absolutely mandatory, but it's not mandatory that you cover them in every single management review. So if you are inclined to take all of this content and split it up into more manageable pieces, that's fine. That's absolutely permitted. What you can't do is just choose to skip something and never get back to it. Now, we have found a lot of organizations like to use PowerPoint presentations to go over this content. Now, that's fine. It's not mandatory, but it's important to recognize that the meeting has to have output. We're going to get to that in a slide as well. We also find that a lot of organizations like to use a standardized agenda format to make sure that no required topic is missed. So again, that is not mandatory. This goes into how are you going to control the meeting itself, and that's entirely up to you. Okay, so here's point 3. Now some of this I am going to read to you. The outputs of the management review shall include decisions and actions. That is extremely important verbiage. This goes to something that unfortunately is really often missed, especially for new organizations. The management review meeting is supposed to be productive. It's supposed to lead to decisions and actions. You can even think of this as conclusions. Management review should not just be a churn of information. It should be a productive activity. Then in the final statement in the standard here, it says that the organization shall retain documented information as evidence of the results of management review. That's a record statement. Anytime you see the phrase retain documented information, this implies that it has to be on the record. So the management review process has to be on the record, and it has to cover all of those discussion points, and it has to be productive. So there's a lot here. There's a lot going on within management review. Okay, let's move on now to the second most often cited item, and that's internal audit. Now, internal audit is found right next door to management review in section 9.2. And 9.2 is split up into two subclauses. Now, in the first part here, it states that internal audits have to be conducted at planned intervals to provide information on whether the quality management system, that's key verbiage, conforms to the organization's own requirements for its system, as well as the requirements of this international standard. And they're referring to ISO 9001. And also if the quality management system is effectively implemented and maintained. Okay. So again, our first key takeaway here is this business of planned intervals. And again, the idea is that you can develop whatever scheduling mechanism works for you for making sure that the internal audits take place on time. So if that is a calendar, if that's a database, if that's an automated reminder, or something else along those lines, fine. But you need to show us that your audits are planned. Now, similar to what we talked about earlier with management review, if you are so inclined to conduct the internal audit in small bites, you can do so. So if you have 5 processes and you're going to do one process every other month for the calendar year, great. That's a perfectly acceptable way to organize your internal audit process. If you're more inclined to do it all at once, obviously that's fine too. Now, I want to really emphasize this next bit here. The fact that they talk about you need to be auditing against the requirements of the international standard, that means that you are expected to ensure that all of the requirements from ISO 9001 are included in the internal audit process. And a key takeaway here, this means that the internal audit itself has to be included in the internal audit assessment. And this one comes up again a fair amount of the time for new organizations. You bring in a consultant to do your internal audit. Well, who's going to audit what the consultant did? Because technically that is part of the quality management system. So again, you are required to audit the audit. Now, how you choose to do that, of course, is entirely up to you. Okay, another key point here. You are expected to do these internal audits against the quality management system. The quality management system is what you're auditing. I want you to remember that ISO 9001 specifies that a quality management system is made up of processes. And that's actually born out of section 441, where it says that the organization needs to determine the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. So therefore, it is expected that you should be able to structure your internal audits with respect to the processes that make up your quality management system, and not the clauses of ISO 9001:2015 itself. Wherever possible, you should be striving to conduct a process-based internal audit. And that's a very key part of this. The second part of the internal audit requirement from the standard has some very key points that I want to highlight for you here. Again, there's verbiage about planning and carrying out the audit program, defining what your audit criteria and your scope are going to be, and that goes to this idea that you can do a portion of your system at a time. Select auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. We'll get back to that idea in a second. Ensuring that the results of the audits are reported. That's typically going to be done within the management review process. And then these last 2 points, taking appropriate correction and corrective action without undue delay, and then retaining documented information as evidence of implementation of the audit program. And again, retaining identifies a record requirement. So let's get into these highlights here. First of all, you'll note that none of what we just read specifies anything specific related to auditor competency. Now, we get asked this a lot. Well, what do I have to do to make sure my internal auditors are competent? Well, that is entirely up to you. Just like any other task in a quality management system, the organization has to decide for itself what makes an internal auditor competent. It is your system after all. Now, it's imperative that your qualification records not just consist of a training sign-off. You do need to define competency requirements, and that comes from section 7.2. Now, a key item that comes up is a lack of responsiveness to internal audit nonconformances. Now, again, this is key here. If you write it within an internal audit, if you write a nonconformance within an internal audit, that needs to be treated with the same seriousness as that which you afford, say, a customer complaint or a nonconformance that's written by PJR when we come to see you. And again, you'll recall that the requirement specifies both correction and corrective action. Correction, of course, being the immediate fix, and then corrective action being the systemic action taken to prevent recurrence. And again, I pointed out this business of retaining documented information. This is another record requirement, and you are required to keep records of the internal audit process. Now, how you record the internal audit, whether you're going to use checklists or a special form or something along those lines, now obviously that's at your discretion. But remember that the internal audit records need to be sufficiently detailed to give us confidence that you audited the whole system and that you audited the system against all of the requirements from ISO 9001. So, sometimes we go into an organization and we ask for the records of the internal audit, and we're handed some nonconformances that were written up. Well, that's certainly an important piece of it, but where's the rest of it? Where's the evidence of what you looked at in the context of the internal audit? So bear that in mind. The internal audit record should paint a picture of what the internal auditor reviewed. Now, I want to make a very key point here on consultants. I know it's very common, very popular for an organization to choose to outsource their internal audit program to a consultant, and that is perfectly acceptable. It's absolutely permitted. But remember that regardless of who is performing the audit, the responsibility for the audit program, the maintenance of the records, responding to nonconformances, all of those things are the responsibility of the organization, not the consultant. The organization should be able to speak confidently about their internal audit process and how it's controlled. So if we ask you, how do you manage your internal audit program? How do you schedule internal audits? You shouldn't be coming back with just, well, we have a consultant for that. You should be able to speak about how you are controlling this process, just like any other process in your quality management system. Okay, moving on to the third most common item for nonconformances. This is quality objectives. Now for this, we find the requirements are primarily rooted in section 6.2. So what do these requirements say? Well, first of all, it states in general that you shall establish quality objectives and that your quality objectives need to be consistent with the quality policy. They need to be measurable. That's a key point. You need to take into account applicable requirements. They need to be relevant to conformity of products and services and enhance customer satisfaction. And they need to be monitored, communicated, and updated as appropriate. Okay, so let's dig into this just a little bit more here. So first of all, we have this business of objectives need to be measurable. And without measurability, there's really no way to know if the objective was met or not. So we get asked this sometimes. Well, if I have an objective where I say I want to achieve this certification, I want to get NADCAP accredited, or we want to sell 1 million units of product by the end of the third quarter, or something where it is a pass-fail type objective. We call that an attribute type objective. Those are absolutely acceptable, completely acceptable. Obviously, they're not going to be as common as a variable type measurement. So with a variable type measurement, we say, okay, we want to have 98% on-time delivery. Well, that's something that you can measure, and you'll either get close to it or you'll exceed it, things of that nature. Second key point. This business about the objectives needing to be relevant to customer satisfaction and products and services. That was a new requirement when ISO 9001:2015 was first published. Now, it's important to note that if you have objectives for things like profitability or safety, those are perfectly fine, absolutely acceptable. But you need to make sure that you have objectives that get to the conformity of your products and the satisfaction of your customers as well, in addition to the other objectives. And also, quality objectives are a topic that everyone in the quality management system is expected to be aware of. So what does that mean? How do you accomplish that? Obviously, there's a lot of ways you can get the word out about objectives. You might have placards. You might have special meetings about these things. You might have cards that you hand out. Whatever you choose to do, it's up to you. It just needs to be accomplished, and it needs to be effective. The second part of the quality objectives requirement reads as follows. When planning how to achieve the objectives, you will determine what will be done, what resources will be required, who's responsible, when it will be completed, and how the results will be evaluated. Now, it's interesting, in the ISO 9002 standard, the supplemental standard, gives a little bit of clarity on what they mean by what will be done. The organization needs to determine the actions that need to be implemented to achieve the quality objectives. Now, the key takeaway from part 2 is the idea that it's not enough to just have the objectives. You are, of course, expected to track progress towards your objectives and take action to improve quality objectives performance. Now, when they talk about necessary action, it means an appropriate response. It doesn't necessarily mean a formal corrective action, but you have to do something. If you have a quality objective that is underperforming, you can expect your auditors to ask you, okay, fine, you didn't hit your mark on this. What are you doing about it? What are you doing to improve performance? You can absolutely expect that question. Moving on to number 4, monitoring and measuring resources. Some of our guests on the call today probably know this requirement as calibration. We refer to monitoring and measuring resources as any device or tool or gauge or so forth that's used to perform monitoring and measurement of outputs. Now, you probably call this inspection and or testing. Now, our primary clause here is 715, and again has 2 subclauses. Now, in part 1, there are some very broad statements about selecting the gauges that you need, making sure that they're appropriate for what you're using them for. But then we have this last statement, and here is the kind of the key bit in part one. You will retain appropriate documented information of fitness for use for purpose of the monitoring and measurement resources. So what does that mean? Retaining documented information for fitness for use. Well, for most organizations, that is going to be the calibration or verification records for all measurement devices. Now, in terms of what the content of those records is going to be, for that we turn to the second part of the requirement. So let's jump right to that. Okay. Now there's a lot of verbiage here. I want to try to highlight the key pieces here. Again, measuring equipment shall be, first of all, calibrated or verified, or both, at specified intervals against measurement standards traceable to international or national measurement standards. Measuring equipment shall also be identified so that we know what its status is, and then obviously safeguarded, and if found to be invalid later, have a process for looking at prior measurement results. So our key takeaways here, and the two most commonly cited items in terms of nonconformances. First of all, this required traceability to national or international standards. Now here in the United States, that is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in almost all cases, or NIST. There are occasionally situations where there is no NIST traceable method for a particular measurement device. There's very few circumstances left where that's the case, but where that is the case, typically it's the device manufacturer that provides the calibration. So often we have situations where devices, the records are either cannot be found, or there is no specific traceability to a NIST standard, or something along those lines. Now, the other item that comes up a lot is consistent and reliable identification of these measurement devices in order to determine status. Now, I want to point something out here. This does not automatically mean calibration stickers. We do get this from time to time. We have to have calibration stickers. No, you don't. What you have to be able to do is point out that the device is identified in such a way that you can trace back to the calibration record. And it's up to you what that means. Okay. The last item I want to talk about here in terms of common nonconformances is going to be external provider approvals. Now, if you go back to the older versions of ISO 9001, this is a group that's had a lot of different names along the way. If you go back to the 94 version of the standard, they were called subcontractors. When we got to 2000 and 2008, they were called suppliers. Now in 2015, they are called external providers. An external provider is meant to be a very inclusive term. It's meant to account for suppliers as well as folks that you outsource to, outside partners, and so forth. Hence the phrase external. Anyone that's externally providing into your quality management system. Now, beyond the changes in terminology, the requirement is more or less the same. It's presently found in section 8.4.1. And there's two key phrases here that I want to point out. First of all, you need to determine and apply criteria to evaluate, select, monitor performance, and reevaluate external providers, and you need to retain documented information of those evaluation activities. So what does that mean? Well, just like everything else we've looked at today, it's up to you what it means to evaluate an external provider, and whether or not you have alternatives to that evaluation. Some organizations might require one form of evaluation, say for raw materials, and an entirely different form of evaluation for outside laboratories or something of that nature. So again, it's up to you what that methodology is going to be. Now, again, you should note that the requirement calls for a reevaluation. So it is not enough to simply say, okay, you're approved, good to go, and then forget about it. And lastly, again, I want to make sure we're not missing the inclusion of the phrase retained documented information. Again, a record. And it states that retained documented information of these evaluation activities has to be on the record. And that is very, very important terminology on the part of the standard. It means that having the external provider's name on a list is not sufficient evidence of evaluation. It does not constitute a record of evaluation activity. How did you get this external provider to the point of being approved? Not just who is the approved external provider. Very key distinction. And again, it comes down to this business of records of these evaluation activities having to be maintained. Okay, so because we're talking about ISO 9001:2015, there's two other areas that I like to cover in any presentation that I give on this standard. And those two areas are risk and interested parties. So let's begin with risk. The term risk is used a grand total of 16 times in the auditable portion of ISO 9001:2015. And when you read the requirement, they view the identification and management of risk as a system-wide strategy, very much the same way that continual improvement was viewed when the 2000 version of ISO 9001 was published. One of the most important takeaways from this is that it is not required that you have a formal risk management process, not required at all. So this idea of risk aversion is something that affects the entire quality management system. And again, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this. In ISO 9002 even, they discuss key risks that include the failure of processes, products, and services to meet requirements, or the organization not achieving customer satisfaction. So at a minimum, that risk is potentially always there and always needs to be considered. So what is the actual verbiage from ISO 9001? Well, in 611, it states the following, that when you plan for your system, you need to consider the issues referred to in section 4.1. This means both those that come from inside and outside the organization, and requirements that are referred to in section 4.2. Now, these are requirements that come from both internal and external interested parties. And determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to, first of all, to give assurance that the quality management system can achieve its intended results, to enhance the desired effects, and then to prevent or reduce undesired effects. And this gets into the idea that it's both risks and opportunities, this two-part way in which the standard is written, and then overall to achieve improvement. Then in 612, it states that the organization needs to plan actions to address the risks and opportunities, and how to implement those actions into the quality management system processes and evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. So what do they mean by actions to address risks and opportunities? Now for this, again, we turn to ISO 9002 for some ideas on how we go about doing that. And actions to address in ISO 9002 is broken down into 5 key areas. First of all, risk avoidance. If you can possibly stop doing the process from which the risk is coming and just avoid it altogether, that's one possible strategy. To limit the risk. And this gets into, okay, we'll write a procedure for this. We'll write a work instruction for this so that people do whatever the task is in the correct way and therefore reduce the risk. Sharing of the risk. This could be working with your customers. This could be working with your suppliers on something like, for example, bulk purchasing of raw materials to limit the risk of raw material running out at a bad time. Risk transfer. This could be something like insurance or other similar arrangements. And then finally, risk acceptance. And that is the idea that when you've taken the reasonable measures, accepting that the remaining risk is acceptable and can be worked with. So how do we audit all this? How does PJR audit this concept? Well, we have trained our auditors to ask about risk in a very open fashion and be prepared to examine the activities that are presented by the auditee. When we ask you about risk, we expect that you understand the concept and that, again, like everything else in your system, that you can speak confidently on what your approach has been. Now, I always like to point out that in ISO 9001, there's really only one requirement that specifically mandates records of risk actions, and that's within management review. In 932E, it states that the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities be included in the management review process. And then, of course, 933 says that you have to keep records of management review. So the rest of it is up to you. But again, you need to be prepared to answer confidently on this topic if you're asked about it. Now, the last item I want to cover today that's out of the standard is the concept of interested parties. Now, there is an official definition for interested parties, and it reads as follows. This is going to be a person or organization that can be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. And they give a fairly extensive list of examples of who this might include. So this is going to be customers, people within the organization, suppliers, competitors, and so forth. Now in section 4.2, it states that the organization needs to determine who their interested parties are, but goes on to state that these are going to be interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. So the idea is that as an organization, you need to make sure that your quality management system is considering the relevant input requirements. And using this term interested party, it was meant to broaden the scope of who those requirements were going to be coming from. And the big idea here, of course, is that you should be cognizant of applicable requirements. That's good business, right? So a key takeaway from this is, in most cases, it's going to be inappropriate for an organization to conclude that their only interested party group is their customer base. So we've trained our auditors that if the organization says to us, well, the only interested party is the customers, we've trained our auditors to ask some probing questions about that and say, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? What process did you follow? What analysis did you perform to arrive at that decision? Now, if no analysis can be shown, it's likely that the process by which the interested parties were selected was flawed, and it's possible in that circumstance that a nonconformance would be issued. Now, in terms of how long the list might be of who the interested parties are, for that we turn to ISO 9002 once again, and as you can see, there is a very extensive list of possibilities provided. And we get into some very interesting items: local community groups, government bodies, neighboring organizations, unions, and so forth. So, obviously, recognizing that there's going to be a variety of interested parties, well, how do we go about figuring out what they want and what the influence is going to be on our quality management system? Well, again, there's good guidance in ISO 9002 for this, and these are all activities that a lot of you on our call today are probably already doing. Things like reviewing your orders, lobbying, participating in an association, doing market surveillance, having customer surveys or user surveys, monitoring customer satisfaction. These are all ways in which you can identify interested party requirements. Now, are there nonconformances pertaining to interested parties? There are two, actually, in terms of requirements from the standard. First of all, if there is either no evidence or very limited evidence of an implemented process for monitoring and review of interested party information, that would represent a violation of Section 4.2. Also, if there is no evidence that interested party feedback is being discussed within management review, that would represent a violation of Section 932C1. So there's one more item I want to discuss here, and that is the idea of leadership from Section 5.1. Now, when we developed our new audit report for ISO 9001-2015, we developed some targeted questions to ask the management team, and we put this under the heading of the leadership interview. Now, our audit report directs auditors also to make sure that leadership is involved in the management of the system. So let's get into now what is included in the leadership interview. The leadership interview begins with what are you specifically doing to make yourself accountable for the quality management system effectiveness. And that's drawn more or less right out of Section 511, this idea of accountability. So we ask about it. How do you make yourself accountable? How do you participate in the quality management system? Who are the interested parties? Do you have your arms around the idea of interested parties? Do you have a process to monitor interested party requirements? And what are some current internal and external issues that you're attempting to address? What we're trying to do with these questions is, can we conclude that you are involved, that you have your arms around what's going on in the quality management system? That's the big picture of what we're going for here. Now, another key point, leadership is supposed to mean multiple persons in most cases. When we get our completed audit report, sometimes when we look at the leadership interview, we see that it only includes a single individual. Now, if you've got a small company, 3 to 5 people, that's conceivable. But as the organization gets larger, the idea that leadership is still going to be wrapped up in one person, that becomes less plausible. You work together as a management team, so therefore we want you to speak together as a management team as well when we have the leadership interview. Now, 9002 has got some guidance on leadership as well. The idea of what does top management mean. And it says that although there are certain authorities and responsibilities that can be delegated, accountability still remains with top management. So in other words, yes, you can still have a management representative. There's probably several of you on the call today that remember that term. But it does not mean that you can dump the whole system in the management representative's lap anymore. That has changed. And again, we drive that, so much of that from section 5.1. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of stuff today. We've covered requirements from several places of the standard. And I mentioned at the front end of my presentation that there's going to be circumstances where we don't agree. This is an interpretive document after all. So what happens if we have a client who's just gone through an audit and says, I don't like this nonconformance? Okay. PJR is required to provide a process for an impartial review of contested nonconformances. Now, we call this the dispute process. Now, our process for filing a dispute is explained in PJR Procedure Pro 10. Now, if you want a copy of Pro 10, you can download it for free off of our website. If you go to www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, you're going to look for a link called Registration Document Download, and you can download a copy of Pro 10 for yourself. Now, if you are completing an audit and you want to file a dispute, you have to file that dispute within 15 calendar days of the end of the audit. So in conclusion, ISO 9001-2015 remains the world's most utilized standard. There are just over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide, and many of the items that are cited in nonconformances, as I hope you can see, are entirely avoidable, and they do seem to come up time and time again. I do hope that the content of our presentation today will leave you feeling more confident that things are going to go well on audit day. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive into ISO 9001, we do have a clause-by-clause course. If you have someone that needs to really do an in-depth review of ISO 9001, this is a great course for you. It is on our website and it is 100% free, so definitely check it out. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have presentations on non-applicable clauses and understanding what can and cannot be excused in an audit assessment. We have a very popular presentation on the interaction of processes and how this contributes to the success of your audit. And we've got webinars on a wide variety of other topics, things like corrective actions, stage 1 auditing, and numerous standards. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to go to our website at www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space, and click subscribe. That will opt you in for automatic updates on new webinars, updates to the standards, and other points of information. I do thank you for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard and see if we have some questions today. And it appears that we do. Okay. Okay. Okay, question from Alexis Conway. In the beginning of the presentation, you said there are no requirements, but mentioned several during the management review section. How can you receive a nonconformance in an audit if there are no requirements and it's interpretive? Well, Alexis, what I actually said was there are no procedural requirements. You're not required to have a procedure for management review. You are absolutely required to have management review meetings. And ISO 9001, as we learned today, has several requirements pertaining to the content of those management review meetings. Mary Hall asks, we are a distributor AS 9120. How does monitoring and measuring pertain to us since we do no testing or calibration of equipment? We only visually inspect. Well, Mary, I do not have the authority to speak on AS 9120 specifically, but I can tell you in an ISO 9001 environment that it is possible for there to be such circumstances where there are no measuring devices, and therefore those requirements would not apply to you. Maritza Moreno asks, how exactly do we audit the internal audits? Well, Maritza, that's entirely up to you. There are a number of ways that you can do so. I am not, unfortunately, permitted to give you exact methodologies that would represent a conflict of interest as a certification body representative. You may wish to run that question by a consultant. Sally Dahlquist, please give examples of metrics for leadership. What are measurable items for leadership? Sally, again, I'm afraid I'm not permitted to give an exact response on that. I can tell you that there are a number of ways you can measure the effectiveness of a leadership process. You may wish to address your question to a consultant. Adam Drummond asks, the requirement for external provider approvals calls for reevaluation. If I have documented information and records to prove competence for employees of an outside company to do work in our facility, how long should this be good for? If the equipment does not change, are they good for the life of the piece of the equipment? Interesting question, Adam. I would say that as presented, you've made a compelling argument in terms of external provider having a process in place, having a means to evaluate over a long term. I have to be careful about what I say is acceptable versus not acceptable and specifying an approach. But again, it sounds like this is something that you've thought out, and it sounds like it would be accepted in the context of an audit. Okay, we have a similar question from Ken Cosrow on auditing an audit. Again, Ken, I'm afraid you will have to address that question to a consultant. I do apologize that I can't answer that specifically. Okay. Jeff Watson, your question states filters and strainers on liquid products for consistency of equipment versus measuring equipment. Jeff, I think you're asking me would we qualify that as a measurement device? I'm not going to address that specifically. What I am going to say is, in general, when we're talking about measuring devices, obviously, it's primarily up to the organization to make a determination on what the measurements need to be and where a measurement device is necessary. And again, the auditor may look at the same facts and interpret things differently. And that's where we would have possibly a dispute or a disagreement if there is a strong disconnect. Okay. Jeff Sitkin asks, while process-based audits are mandated in Section 4, are desk-based audits entirely precluded? Can there be an effective mix of both? Absolutely, yes. The methodology of the audit can absolutely include a desktop type assessment. Brenda Bonpatra asks, is it required to verify traceability of standard equipment by which the calibration is done? Yes, that is required. Dan Watson asks, are documented criteria for go bad product needed for nonconformities? What are the auditors to look for in generating a nonconforming material condition? Dan, I apologize, I'm not fully understanding your question. If you want to try to rephrase it, I'm not understanding what you're trying to put across. Tim Lyons is asking, when you buy a new piece of inspection equipment that comes with a calibration certificate, can you use the manufacturer's calibration of certificate for the first year and then switch over to an in-house calibration program? Tim, as described, I don't see that as an issue. Obviously, the content of the certificate would be subject to auditor review, but as you have described it, that sounds acceptable to me. Rachel McNeely asks, is there anything specifically stating how many times a year a management review needs to be conducted and what is the year, audit date to audit date? Great question. Frequency of management review is at the organization's discretion. Again, you may recall that the standard says that you need to have a process in place to plan it. Now, bear in mind that you need to have an effective process also. So we have this balancing act. So while there's nothing in the standard that says you absolutely must have it once per calendar year, you have to counter that or balance that with the idea of, well, okay, how can you make your case that you have an effective management review process? But the short version is you can plan it out however you wish and control it out however you wish. Okay. G. Venkataramani Iyer asks, is subcontractor evaluation mandatory? Yes, subcontractors are considered part of external providers. Mary Hall asks, where do on-time delivery reports or supplier performance reports fit into the standard? Well, Mary, those are two separate items. Assuming that you mean the on-time delivery performance of your organization, that's going to potentially come up in a few places. You may use delivery as a means of evaluating something. So potentially that would fall under quality objectives. There's analysis requirements written into Section 9, a couple of other places. Supplier performance is going to be primarily Section 8.4. Okay. Srinivasa Perumal Elumalai asks, we are procuring tools at local retail market. How is the supplier evaluation possible like a calibration supplier? Well, understand that the method of external provider evaluation can vary from case to case. If you are using a local goods store, I mean, that's no different, for example, than going to a local Home Depot to purchase a tool. If it impacts the quality management system, the standard says that there should be some form of evaluation in place, but how extensive that evaluation is can vary depending on appropriate circumstances. Okay. Adhaven MA asks, is there any specific methodology to arrive at the opportunity analysis? Most of the time we are covering risk only, not opportunities. Nothing that I can specifically tell you is mandatory. In terms of how the requirement is written, the idea is that you should be doing an appropriate analysis. You should be recognizing opportunities and responding appropriately. Okay, follow-up from Venkatamani Iyer. Sheet metal products traceability not possible. Now, if you're talking about product traceability, we didn't actually cover that today. That's a separate matter entirely. And traceability requirements when it comes to product potentially might be coming from customers or other interested parties. But if they are not applicable, then they are not applicable. Okay. Okay, Maritza Moreno, we have a welding machine that doesn't get calibrated. We ensure that it heats to a specific temperature. Will this be an issue with monitoring and measurement of equipment? As described, Maritza, that does not sound like an issue. To me, obviously, that would need to be verified in the context of the audit. Remember that what we're talking about here is measuring devices that measure product, and that's key. And that's how the verbiage is written in the standard. Things to make sure that the product is meeting with all applicable requirements. Okay. Okay. All right, and we have time for one more question here. Tim Lyons, do subcontractors that clean the floors or that do not affect product quality need to be qualified through the QMS or qualification? I'm not going to address that question specifically, Tim. What I'm going to say is that there are going to be circumstances where external providers do not have an impact on the quality management system and therefore can be excluded from the process, but we take that on a case-by-case basis. Okay. Okay, and again, one final question here. Similar tact from Maritza Moreno. Are IT and website design companies considered to be interested parties? Well, again, that's up to you as the stewards of the organization. You need to decide for yourself why or why not a party is, um, why or why not that party would be part of your interested party group. Okay, thank you all for your time. Have a great day.